Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, and welcome to our second video in which I'll unearth and uncover and untangle some of the differences between Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies and Professor Tolkien's writings. Now, in the last video I talked about the prologues, really, and I also touched on the long-expected party, and I guess that's where I'll pick up in this video. So, the immediate aftermath of the party is pretty similar in the books and the movies, and both Sir Ian Holm and Sir Ian McKellen do such a fantastic job with their respective characters that these few scenes are just an absolute joy to watch, and honestly, there's not that much more to say about them. Bilbo gives up the ring, and then he goes off on his own adventure, and then Gandalf and Frodo have a little chat, before Gandalf rides off and leaves the Shire behind him. Now, from Frodo's perspective, I guess not much happens at this point. He just kind of stays in the Shire and keeps the ring secret and goes about his business. But from Gandalf's perspective, this part of the story begins an epic adventure that is almost entirely cut from the movies. So, in both the books and the movies, Gandalf rides to Minas Tirith. And in the movies, it's implied he spends, maybe a few weeks there, maybe a few months there, before he rides back to find Frodo in Hobbiton and to let him know that his ring is the One Ring. And in the movies, it implies that Frodo's departure from the Shire takes place no more than about a year after Bilbo's departure. In fact, if you count the Hobbit movies as canon, which I personally don't, but if you do, then there's a moment that actually confirms 100% that Frodo can't have left any more than about a year after Bilbo did. But that is not the case in Tolkien's writings. So we know that Bilbo's farewell party, his 111st birthday party, takes place on his birthday on the 22nd of September in the year 3001 of the Third Age. But this scene, where Gandalf talks to Frodo and fills him in on the One Ring and all that drama, doesn't take place until the 13th of April in the year 3018 of the Third Age, which means 17 long years have passed between this moment and this moment. Now, as I say, from Frodo's perspective, not a huge amount happens in those 17 years. Not a huge amount ever really happens in the Shire. But from Gandalf's perspective, this great big time jump is full of awesome adventures. And these adventures, I guess, are pretty much what I'm going to spend this video talking all about. So, what the movies show us is this. Gandalf riding all the way south, all the way to Minas Tirith, where he looks over the scrolls of Isildur and learns that Bilbo's ring may possibly be the One Ring. And this does happen in Tolkien's writings, but it is only a tiny, tiny part of what Gandalf is truly up to in this 17-year time jump. So, in Tolkien's Legendarium, Gandalf doesn't just ride straight to Minas Tirith. And it's very easy for us to forget this, but Gandalf at this point in the story does not know really anything about Bilbo's ring or where he got it. Actually, that's not true. He knows two things. One, it was found by Bilbo somewhere in the Misty Mountains. And two, it was taken from a strange creature called Gollum. So armed with just these two pieces of information, Gandalf sets out on a quest to try and learn as much as he can about this mysterious ring. So the first thing that he needs to do is to hunt down its original owner.
I looked everywhere for the creature Gollum.
And he did, man. He really did. Gandalf spends years and years hunting over these vast swathes of land. He travels immense distances from the north to the east to the south, searching for the guy who is possibly the most elusive dude in all of Middle-earth. In fact, Gandalf even travels all the way to the mountains of Mordor. But he does not go on this quest alone. You see, if I was going to go on a quest ranging around Middle-earth to try and hunt down this little guy who does not want to be found, I think I'd want to recruit a ranger to help me do it. And it seems Gandalf has the same idea, because he soon teams up with his very good friend / ace in the hole, Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Now, in both the books and the movies, our first introduction to Aragorn is when we meet him in the Prancing Pony, when he's going by Strider. But that is not his first chronological contribution to the War of the Ring. No, a decade earlier, Aragorn was recruited to help Gandalf hunt down the creature Gollum. And this is a very important, if somewhat overshadowed, part of the story. So, as I say, Gandalf and Aragorn spend over a decade travelling to every conceivable location in Middle-earth, trying to find any sign of Gollum. But as the years wear on and on and on, it seems that Gandalf begins to lose faith that they're ever going to find him. And so Gandalf decides he needs to change his strategy. And this is when he ventures off to Minas Tirith. And just like in the movie, he goes to Minas Tirith to look over the scrolls of Isildur and hopefully find some kind of information that might cast some light on the nature of Bilbo's mysterious ring. And just like in the movies, these scrolls are really helpful, and they teach Gandalf how to identify the One Ring by throwing it into fire. So Gandalf takes this info and he decides it's a pretty good place to start, so he rides all the way back up north towards the Shire. And although this is kind of glossed over in the movies, I do want to just take a moment to clarify how far away these places are. Like, it takes a very, very long time to ride from Gondor in the south all the way up north to the Shire. And Gandalf doesn't actually make it. You see, on his journey from Minas Tirith, he encounters a messenger that no one would expect to find on the road up to Hobbiton. You see, Gandalf encounters a wood elf, a messenger that's come all the way from Lothlorien. And this elven messenger has come with exceptionally good news. You see, whilst Gandalf was away reading in Minas Tirith, Aragorn has just gone ahead and done the impossible. He tracked Gollum all the way to the dead marshes, and there he captured him, and finally accomplished the quest that he and Gandalf set out to do 16 years earlier. But to be honest, I guess capturing Gollum, well, that's the easy part. Because Aragorn now has to transport him all the way back up north. And so Aragorn goes on this mad journey through the Emyn Muil, crossing the Anduin River and going all the way up to the forest of Fangorn, where he walked north along the edges of the forest all the way to Lothlorien, where of course that messenger was sent to intercept Gandalf. But Lothlorien is not Aragorn's final destination, not even close. See, he heads north for miles and miles, all the way to the Carrock, which is where the Eagles dropped off Bilbo and Thorin and the dwarves and everyone else about 76 years earlier. And then Aragorn keeps going, and he has to cross the Anduin again, this time with the help of Beorn. Remember him? And his son, whose name is Grimbeorn. And when he finally arrives at the edges of Mirkwood, Aragorn travels all the way east to the halls of the elven king Thranduil. Now, this journey is in and of itself pretty nuts, but don't forget Aragorn did the whole thing with Gollum as his prisoner. Like, it blows my mind. I can't even fathom how Aragorn was able to accomplish something like that. So, if anyone thinks Aragorn's a bit of an overrated character, I'd like to see anyone else in Middle-earth try to do a journey like that with no one to talk to except Gollum. Ugh. But anyway, it is in Thranduil's halls that Gollum is eventually imprisoned. And there's a pretty cool potential for speculating here, because as we know, Thranduil's son is Legolas. And we know that Legolas will befriend Aragorn and join the Fellowship in only about 18 months from this part of the story. And we also know that the only reason Legolas went to the Council of Elrond in the first place was to let the wise folk of Rivendell know that Gollum had escaped. So, it's very possible, although in no way stated by Tolkien, that Aragorn and Legolas may have actually briefly met while Aragorn was bringing Gollum to Legolas's father. Anyway, Aragorn doesn't stay in Mirkwood for very long, but it's at this point that Gandalf comes back into our story. So Gandalf journeys to Mirkwood and he interrogates Gollum over a few days, and it's here that he learns all about Smeagol and Deagle, and he learns that Gollum was once a type of river hobbit called a Stoor. But the thing that worries Gandalf the most is the revelation that just before Aragorn captured Gollum in the Dead Marshes, Gollum had been set free from the dungeons of Barad-dûr, where he had come face to face with the Dark Lord Sauron. And after being tortured by Sauron, who Gollum actually describes as having only 4 fingers on his black hand, although he does also say, but they were enough, which kind of implies to me that Gollum was tortured by Sauron personally. And it also tells us that despite what we see in the movies, Sauron does kind of have a physical form. Like, he's not just a great big orange eye that's kind of hovering above the Tower of Barad-dûr. He does have a physical form, and he has 4 fingers on his black hand. But anyway, we all know what happened next, don't we? And so when Gandalf hears all this, he leaves Mirkwood and he races back to the Shire to, I guess, confirm what by now he must already know. Bilbo's ring is the One Ring. So that catches us all the way back up with the movie, which I guess it's not really fair to say changed this part of the story, it just didn't include it. But in the book, Gandalf arrives back in Hobbiton in April, and he talks to Frodo about the ring and Gollum, and he gets Frodo up to speed just like in the movie. And just like in the movie, this scene ends with Gandalf catching Sam Gamgee eavesdropping.
I ain't been dropping no eaves, sir, honest.
And forcing him to accompany Frodo on his quest to Rivendell. Now, as I already said, Gandalf and Frodo have this conversation in April, but it's not until the end of the following September that Frodo actually leaves Bag End. So, unlike in the movies, in the books, the hobbits are so much more leisurely at the beginning of their quest. But as always, Gandalf does not stick around this long, and soon after leaving the Shire, he begins to hear stories about a black shadow and a sudden attack on the Gondorian city of Osgiliath. So, about 2 months after this moment in the Shire, 1,000+ miles away in Gondor, 2 brothers awake from a cryptic but strangely prophetic dream. And these brothers are the sons of the steward, Boromir and Faramir. Now, this dream isn't that important at this moment. It basically just tells them to go to Rivendell, find the sword that was broken, and there you're gonna meet a halfling, and he's gonna be very important. And we all know that Boromir goes to Rivendell, and we all know what happens to him in the following 8 months. But the very next day, the next day after Boromir and Faramir have this dream, Osgiliath comes under attack. And this attack marks the very first battle, the opening conflict in the War of the Ring. Now, in an extended scene from the Two Towers, we do get a flashback to this battle, but it's told very, very differently. Like in the movie, they seem to be celebrating taking the city back, but that's not what Tolkien tells us at all. In the book, the eastern part of Osgiliath is completely overrun by Haradrim and Easterlings, and the Great Bridge that separates the eastern half from the western half is destroyed. In fact, the defenders of Osgiliath are almost entirely wiped out, and only Boromir, Faramir, and 2 others are able to escape with their lives. And there's something interesting here, because Boromir later recounts at the Council of Elrond that the reason Osgiliath was so completely taken by the enemy is because he encountered a strange power that he had never witnessed before. He and his men were gripped by a sense of dread that issued from a great horseman robed in black. Now, you and I know that this Black Rider is, of course, the Lord of the Nazgul, but in Gondor, this is not common knowledge. And so, when the rider breaks off the attack and begins riding north with 8 other companions, the men of Gondor consider this a lucky break. And, I mean, how could they know at this point the enormity of what had just begun? Now, this may not sound particularly relevant to what I was talking about earlier, but it is, because this battle demonstrates a little something about Sauron's overall strategy. You see, Tolkien tells us that at the same time Osgiliath was taken, in the southwest of Middle-earth, up in the northeast, another warband of Sauron's orcs attack the woodland realm of King Thranduil. And in the chaos of this coordinated attack, the creature Gollum escapes. Or perhaps he was set free to continue his hunt for the ring. And this demonstrates just how intelligent Sauron truly is. Like, I guess it's easy to forget, because Sauron never really appears on the page as like a dynamic character. He's always just in the background. But he is the Lord of the Rings. The War of the Ring is a war of his design. And so, in Tolkien's writings, he is a lot more than just a big fiery eye in the sky that stares at people and whispers their name ominously. He is a very dangerous, but very worthy Dark Lord. Now, anyway, it is at this point that Gollum flees all the way into Moria, which is of course where we meet up with him again later in the story. But before I finish this video, I do want to go back to Gandalf and talk about one more big thing that he's got to do before Frodo leaves Bag End. So, on Midsummer's Day, Gandalf is travelling along the Greenway Road when he encounters an old friend and fellow Eastar, fellow wizard, Radagast the Brown. Now, Radagast has been searching for Gandalf for quite some time because he has a message from, the worst character in this story, Saruman. Now, this message is basically a warning that the Nazgul are searching for a place called the Shire, and Gandalf must go to Saruman immediately. So, as we know, Gandalf does go to Saruman, and obviously we know Saruman's a traitor who's going to imprison him, but to be fair to Radagast, he has no idea of this, and so he thought he was just being a helpful guy and trying to pass on a message. So it's hard to stay mad at Radagast. It's not like he betrayed Gandalf on purpose, or anything like that. Although, actually, I should say, before Gandalf goes to Orthanc, he makes a quick stop-off in Bree. You see, he realizes if the Nazgul truly are looking for the Shire, then he knows that Frodo needs to get out of there about as quickly as possible. And so he writes a letter, and he goes to the Prancing Pony and he gives this letter to the barkeeper of the Prancing Pony, one Mr. Barlaman Butterbur. But, quite important, Barlaman Butterbur forgets to send this letter, and so Frodo never receives Gandalf's warning, and he doesn't even realize this letter exists until he comes to the Prancing Pony a good while later. But anyway, back to Gandalf. He is imprisoned in Orthanc for over 2 months, while Saruman begins amassing what will eventually become his great army. But as we know, Gandalf will eventually be rescued by the great eagle Gwaihir the Windlord. Although it doesn't go quite the same as in the movie, because in the movie there's like a moth that does the communicating, whereas in the books, Gwaihir is sent by Radagast, which is a nice bit of redemption for the Brown Wizard, because it proves that unlike Saruman, Radagast is not a traitor. So anyway, Gwaihir carries Gandalf to safety, and in the movie, it's kind of implied that Gandalf just rides the eagle all the way to Rivendell. But Isengard and Rivendell are really, really far away from each other. And despite what the internet may tell you, eagles are not just Middle-earth's taxi service. So Gwaihir drops off Gandalf not with the elves, but in the much, much closer lands of Rohan. So Gandalf has no choice but to journey as a beggar all the way to the capital of Rohan, Edoras, where he meets the one and only King Theoden. Although, of course, at this point in the books, Theoden's health is failing, and he's very much under the control of Gríma Wormtongue. However, in spite of this, Theoden knows better than to imprison Gandalf, and so he reluctantly offers him any horse of his choosing, so long as he uses it to get the hell out of Rohan. Now, Theoden immediately lived to regret this gift, because of course the horse that Gandalf chooses is none other than the chief of the Mayoras, Shadowfax. And he's like probably the best horse in Middle-earth. So after 2 days, Gandalf follows Shadowfax, who I should say is totally wild and has never been tamed by any of the men of Rohan. But Gandalf eventually does tame him. And from that day on, he is Gandalf's exclusive steed. So, it is on the 23rd of September that Gandalf and Shadowfax officially team up, and Gandalf rides north away from Rohan towards the Shire. Now, the reason that date is important is that on the exact same day, Frodo, Sam, and Pippin finally leave Bag End and begin their long quest to Rivendell. And so I guess that is where I will pick up in our next video. But just before I finish this video, I just want to make a point of saying that if you open up The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and you start reading along, then a lot of what I've talked about today isn't going to be in those chapters. And that's because a lot of what I've just said happens off-page, but because Tolkien is such an outrageously talented author, and because he created such a consistent world with such consistent distances between locations and such thorough appendices, we can actually calculate exactly what day things happened, and we can create this kind of epic timeline of the wider world that Tolkien created. And when you have that in your head, I feel like it really does enrich the story, and it adds this incredible extra dimension to the movies. So I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you learned something, and I hope that what you learned will enhance your experience the next time you sit down and watch the Lord of the Rings movies. And in the next video, I will continue the tale, and I'll talk mostly about Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin as they journey out of the Shire into the Old Forest, meet Tom Bombadil, and encounter the haunted Barrow Downs, which again is almost entirely cut from the films. So hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss that. And until then, dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevaya Melanine.